She said to her friends over clinking glasses and candlelight, "He's just a placeholder, until someone better comes along." And the whole table laughed like it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't know I was standing a few steps away in that narrow hallway between the restrooms and the kitchen, holding the door because a server with a tray needed to pass, frozen in place by the sound of my name. The word placeholder landing like a dull hammer right at the base of my skull, and I took one breath, then another, then walked back to the table as if I hadn't heard a thing, as if I hadn't just watched 2 years of my life get folded into a joke to impress 3 women who could never afford the tip we were about to leave. My name is Liam, 29, software engineer who thought reliability was a redeeming quality. Sophie is 27, marketing, the kind of person who wears confidence like a borrowed coat and never reads the care label. Her friends were Tara, hair always perfect, and opinions sharper than the fork in her hand, Chloe, who leaned forward whenever there was gossip like a plant reaching for light, and Megan, sweet voice, hard eyes, eager to agree with whoever was winning. We were at this downtown place that looked like a magazine photo of date night. Edison bulbs and matte black plates and tiny portions that cost as much as car insurance. And 5 minutes earlier, Sophie had been squeezing my hand under the table while telling a story about a campaign she was leading, and I had smiled because I was happy to see her happy, because that's what you do when you think a future is something you build together. You celebrate the little wins, and you don't keep score. I'd excused myself to the bathroom after we ordered, and on the way back I heard my name like a hook in the air. "Liam's fine," Sophie was saying, voice crystal clear, like objectively fine. He pays half, he's dependable, he's there. But placeholder energy. I mean, come on, I'm 27. I'm not marrying fine. I'm just comfortable until something better comes along. Tara snorted and said, "Girl, that's brutal." And Chloe chimed in, "But honest." And Megan added, "He does seem steady." And Sophie laughed, a bright tinkling thing I'd loved before it cut me in half, and said, "Exactly. Why struggle when I don't have to?" I stood still long enough to feel the anger rise and then settle into something colder, something cleaner, like steel cooling on a workbench. I walked back, slid into my chair, and when the food came, I ate like a machine, tasting none of it, waiting for the moment the bill would arrive like a tiny flag at the end of a race I hadn't known I'd been running alone. When the checkbook landed, I looked at the server and said, "Just my portion, please, this entree and the drink." And Sophie blinked, her pretty smile glitching for a second before she smoothed it over. "Babe, we usually split," she said softly. And I met her eyes and replied just as softly, "Not tonight." Then stood, placed exact cash plus a generous tip, and said, "Good luck." Not loud, not cruel, just a statement of fact. Then walked out into air that suddenly felt a lot easier to breathe. My phone lit up like a slot machine before I reached the car. Sophie, then Tara, then Chloe, then Megan. A mosaic of, "What was that? Not cool. Are you okay? We need to talk." And I did what I should have done long ago. I ignored them. I crashed at my friend Eric's place. Eric, who'd seen enough of life to recognize when a building was condemned even if the lights were still on. And in the morning, with the same calm I used to fix a production bug, I called the utility companies. Everything was in my name because I'd leased the apartment first and she'd moved in later. Electric, gas, internet. Even the parking garage account. For 8 months, Sophie had been an authorized user on my accounts because I'd thought convenience was a kindness. I gave the reps her name and requested transfers effective the start of the next billing cycle. One company wanted her verbal confirmation. I explained I was moving out. She lived there. I provided the authorization code on file. They accepted. Internet flipped immediately. I canceled my streaming services and my half of the gym membership we only used for photos. Around noon, I texted Sophie the minimum courtesy I owed myself. "Utilities are being transferred to your name. I'll pick up my things tomorrow." Her reply came instantly, a masterclass in entitlement. "Jason, WTF." She always called me Jason when she typed too fast, somehow mixing me up with a coworker she'd flirted with last winter. Then, "We need to talk." Then, "You're overreacting." Then, "Don't be dramatic." I muted the thread. Saturday morning, I showed up with Eric and his beat-up pickup, and Sophie was waiting with Megan. Team, fix this with a cute outfit and moral outrage. And her opening line was, "This is ridiculous, Liam. It was girl talk." And I said, "Girl talk where you called me a placeholder you're using until someone richer appears." And Megan tried a soft landing. "Everyone says stupid things." And I said, "She didn't stutter." I walked room to room and took what was mine. My TV, gaming setup, the cookware I'd bought when I moved in, my desk, my books, the bed frame I'd assembled the first week while Sophie shot a time-lapse and captioned it, "Building Our Life." And by the time Eric and I were done, the apartment looked like a staging area for a real estate photo. Empty, echoing, carefully lit too. Distract from the cracks. Sophie's voice went small and fast, panic trying to outrun consequence. "You can't just leave. Rent's due in 2 weeks. I can't afford $2,400 by myself." And I said, "Then get a roommate, or a different apartment, or a budget." And she said, "I make $45 after taxes. That's like $2,900 a month. Rent would be 80%. And I said, "Sounds like math." And she said, "You're heartless." And I said, "You're honest, finally." And then I left. Monday morning at 7:23, a number I didn't recognize called, and I picked up because curiosity still lives in me like a stray cat. It was Sophie, crying, "The power company wants a $400 deposit because I have no history. The gas company wants $300. I don't have $700 sitting around." And I asked, "Did you budget?" And she said, "You're unbelievable." And I said, "You're independent," and hung up. Then came what I now think of as the extinction burst of entitlement. Her mother, Patricia, called me to declare I'd abandoned her daughter. Her father, Robert, showed up at my office to suggest we handle this like men, which is funny if you've ever seen a man try to negotiate someone else paying his adult daughter's bills. And social media did what it always does when someone wants to skip accountability and go straight to applause. Sophie posted a carousel of moody photos titled "Surviving Financial Abuse," and her friends piled into the comments like ants to sugar. I wrote one reply, calm as a contract. "Interesting, considering you told your friends I'm a placeholder you're using for financial convenience. Here is a screenshot of your authorized user status on every utility for 8 months. I gave you 3 days' notice. I am still paying my half of rent through the lease." The post vanished within the hour. Tuesday. Robert materialized again, this time in my lobby, and said, "You're ruining her life over words." And I said, "I'm refusing to sponsor the lifestyle of someone who auditioned my replacement at dinner." And he said, "She's young. She says stupid things." And I said, "I'm young. I make boundaries." And he said, "We'll sue." And I said, "For what? Failing to be your daughter's ATM?" And he left in a flurry of ideas that dissolve in courtrooms. Wednesday. Sophie arrived at Eric's place with Tara and Chloe as backup vocals, drunk enough to believe volume is logic, pounding on the door and slurring, "I know you're in there. We need to talk." And I opened the inner latch and said through the chain, "You're drunk. Go home." And she said, "I am home. You're my home." And I said, "No, I was your plan." And she cried the kind of tears that stain. Reputations. And Tara tried a different script. Be reasonable. She'll lose the apartment. Her credit will be ruined. And I said, "Consequences are how credit works." And Chloe hissed, "You're vindictive." And I said, "I'm consistent." And when they finally left, Sophie texted from a different number, "You ruined my life." And I didn't reply, because a thing can only be ruined if it's a thing not a performance. Thursday, a process server handed me a stack of papers. Sophie had found a lawyer who'd file anything for a fee, and I was being sued for promissory estoppel and unjust enrichment, which is legal code for he promised to keep paying my bills and then stopped. And my cousin Alex, an attorney who enjoys chaos more than golf, read the complaint, laughed until he coughed, and said, "I'll take this pro bono, because I want to frame the dismissal," and drafted a response that was a scalpel dipped in ink. Plaintiff admitted to using defendant as a financial placeholder while waiting for a more affluent partner. No promise exists beyond ordinary cohabitation. Defendant continues to pay prorated rent through the lease. Any enrichment was mutual and contractual. Request for sanctions. The suit evaporated like a puddle in July. Friday, The utilities were shut off because Sophie had not, in fact, paid the deposits. She called from the dark to inform me I was evil and destroying her life, and I said, "I have never destroyed anything in my life. That's your lamp-smashing friend's specialty," and hung up again because the only way to win a game of manipulation is not to sit down at the table. Week 2. Sophie tried reinvention. She showed up in my office parking lot in the sundress I'd bought for her birthday, hair the way I used to compliment it, perfume like the idea of summer, and said, "Can we talk?" And I said, "We are." And she stepped close, put her palm on my chest like a warranty sticker, and whispered, "I miss you. I was stupid. I just wanted to sound cool in front of my friends." And I said, "You wanted to sound rich." And she said, "We were good together." And I said, "We were convenient." And she cried with her eyes, but not her throat. And I said, "Sophie, you showed up to persuade me to pay your bills. If I accepted that we'd be transacting?" And the mask dropped so fast I felt a breeze. "You bastard," she hissed. "You're really going to let me become homeless?" And I said, "No, your parents will charge you $500 a month for the basement and call it teaching you a lesson." And she stepped back, like I'd read a card only she was holding, and left in a drift of anger that would cling to anyone nearby. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson, our landlord, called to say Sophie had asked to break the lease and forfeited her deposit. He told me, unsolicited, that Ashley, his neighbor's daughter, had been bragging for months that Sophie was keeping options open until someone more established came along, and there's a special kind of relief that arrives when the truth confirms the thing you didn't want to know. I moved into a small one-bedroom that I could afford all by myself, and for the first time in months I slept 8 hours without dreaming I was falling through promises. By then, the group chat had detonated into factions and snacks, and someone leaked the screenshot of Sophie's dinner comment, and a few people whom I had considered acquaintances sent me quiet DMs that said some version of, "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to tell you," which is the nice way of confessing they chose the show over the truth. Sophie tried one more play at narrative, a GoFundMe titled, "Help Me Rebuild After Financial Abuse," with a goal of $5,000 and a description written like a soap opera. It raised $127, all from her mother, before Alex sent a letter to the platform, and it disappeared in less than a day. Then came silence, the kind I used to beg for when the apartment was full of ring lights and arguments about why we didn't go to a fancier brunch. And in that quiet, I remembered I like my own company, that cooking for one is still cooking, that a Saturday can be spent building a bookshelf instead of defending a budget. I kept therapy appointments I'd been postponing and learned my way through the grief of discovering I'd been lonely beside someone, and that would have been enough of an ending, the clean sort, except ego doesn't retire just because the cameras are off. 3 weeks after I moved, Sophie texted from another new number. "I need to see you. Urgent." And because I am not a monster, I said, 5 minutes, lobby. And she arrived not dressed to seduce this time, but in old jeans and a hoodie, hair scraped back, face bare, and for a second I felt the ghost of the girl I thought I loved when we first met, the one who liked street tacos and stupid movies and didn't care whether the wine was from a shelf or a list. And then she started speaking and that ghost evaporated. "Liam," she said, "I made a mistake." And I said, "You made a series of choices." And she swallowed and said, "Fine, I made choices, but please listen, because this is complicated." And then she paused long enough to make me wonder which script she'd settled on, and chose the worst one. "I'm late," she said, and lifted her eyes to mine like a question. "I think I might be pregnant." For a heartbeat, the world went white, then narrowed, then steadied. I asked, "How late?" And she said, "A week." And I said, "Have you tested?" And she said, "Not yet, I wanted to talk to you first." And everything in me snapped into alignment because fear is loud, but facts are louder. "Sophie," I said very gently, "we haven't slept together in nearly a month." And she blinked, annoyance flickering across her face before she smoothed it, and said, "Stress can do weird things to a cycle." And I nodded and said, "Stress can also make people lie." And she flinched, then said, "Okay, maybe I'm not, but I could be, and I'm trying to be honest." And I said, honest people bring proof, manipulative people bring emergencies. And she exhaled hard enough to fog glass that wasn't there. Fine, she snapped, mask fully off. I tried to make this easy, but you want hard? Here it is. I can't afford this. And you know I can't. And if you had any decency, you'd help me get through a few months until I figure things out. And I said, the problem with using people is one day they stop working. And she spat, you're going to regret this. And I said, I've regretted enough. And she left, muttering something about male fragility that sounded like a podcast. The twist, if you need one, arrived a week later, not with drama, but with the soft thud of reality. A mutual friend sent me a link to Sophie's new account on a creator platform. In the profile bio, she'd written, rebuilding after a toxic relationship. And in a live stream watched by 19 people, she told a teary story about how her ex abandoned her after she made a mistake, because he was. Afraid of commitment. And then, in the kind of hubris that only lives easily in front of strangers, she bragged about how placeholders pay for the light bill if you play them right, then laughed at her own line, and someone clipped it and sent it to her mother, and Patricia called me, not to apologize, but to ask if I'd consider letting bygones be bygones, which is a sentence only people on the wrong side of cause and effect say with a straight face. 2 days after that, Sophie texted again, this time with a photo of a negative test and a caption that read, I'm not pregnant. Can we at least talk? And I said, you lied about being late to borrow leverage. And she said, I panicked. And I said, you strategized. And she went quiet for a long time and then replied with the line that will live in my head as a perfect summary of everything. I'm sorry you took what I said so personally. At some point, you run out of words for that kind of shamelessness. You don't argue with it, you turn off the faucet. Eric and I celebrated my promotion. Yes, that happened because apparently sleep and peace are productivity hacks, and he asked me what I'd learned, the way friends do, when they want to check whether the lesson stuck, and I said, that kindness without boundaries is a charity scammers love to find. That love without respect is just access. That anyone who calls you a placeholder doesn't deserve a place. Sometimes, when the city is too loud and the algorithms too insistent, I take a drive out where the streets go dark and the sky feels taller, and I sit in the quiet with my phone off and remember that I am not a plan B, not a backup bankroll, not a stepping stone in someone else's ladder. Sophie will be fine, because people like her always land on someone who doesn't know yet, and I won't be there to warn him because it's not my job to run a lighthouse for ships that ignore charts. Maybe one day she'll learn that a person isn't a placeholder, that money isn't love, that I'm being honest isn't a spell that turns cruelty into courage, but I won't wait for that day. My life is already happening. If you want an epilogue, here it is. Months later, I got a text from a new number that started, I know you probably hate me, but... And I blocked it without reading the rest because closure isn't something you get from the person who broke the jar. It's something you give yourself when you stop trying to drink from it. I paid my last portion of the old rent, got my full deposit back from Mr. Peterson with a note that said, proud of you, kid, bought a plant that is somehow still alive, and hung a small print above my desk that says, in plain black letters, believe what they say when they think you can't hear. That was the night at the trendy restaurant with the Edison bulbs and the tiny plates. That was the hallway between the restrooms and the kitchen. That was the sentence that took a life I thought we were building and handed it back to me in one piece. She said I was a placeholder. She was wrong. I was the door, and I learned how to close.